William was an ugly, disgusting, worthless, lonely loser, who was isekai by the earth god into a magical realm, even gaining a cheat leveling system to become the strongest swordsman in the world. After jumping in the ocean and gargling on water instead of a black man's meat, he woke up as a baby in this new life, crying as he saw 3 disgusting monsters that were about to eat him. However, the monsters took care of him, and after he was 6 months old, Mary decided to show him the outside world, making him see that he was truly living in a different dimension, and that God had given him a second chance to live a peaceful life. 3 years later, he began learning the flow of mana from Gus, and because he was born a prodigy in this life, Will became the youngest sorcerer to cast legendary class spells in this world. At the same time, Blood the Skeleton would become Will's father figure, as he would teach him how to wield the sword, and to protect those who were weaker than him. Although the ghouls kept many secrets from him, Will wasn't too bothered, because he also had a big secret of his own, which was the fact that he had retained some of the memories from his past life. 8 years had passed since Will started living with the mentally ill morons, and Blood thought that it was time to teach him how to survive on his own. So he took his sword and nearly slashed him apart, but Will used his limitless mana to accelerate away, summoning oil from the ground to make Blood fall, before spawning a spider web to restrain him. However, Blood was able to close to distance and knock his sword away, telling him that he shouldn't have been closing his eyes while they were fighting. Although he had lost the battle, Will realized that all of them were teaching him in their own ways to become a better man, and Blood promised to one day reveal the truth about their undead existence. Later that day, however, as Will saw Mary walking from the temple with a plate of bread on her hand, he wondered why she had always hidden how she made her bread. So later that night, while everyone was asleep, Will snuck into the temple to get some answers, but when he opened up the door, he was shocked to see Mary engulfed in a blaze of blue flames. Afraid that he might lose another family member just like in his previous life, Will rushed in to save Mary from the fire, but ended up burning both of his arms in the process. Waking up the following morning, he saw Mary crying by his bed, as she felt like everything could have been avoided if she had just told him the truth about her daily bread ritual. Even so, Blood was furious at him for snooping around even after promising to tell him the truth once he got older, but he commended him for being brave enough to save Mary from the fire. Gus, on the other hand, decided to be a bit more friendly, so he explained to Will how everyone in their world worshipped a particular god, and that Mary's god was Matter, the god of nature. Mary added that because the 3 of them had signed a contract with Stagnate, the god of the undead, they were all cursed to never again receive the blessings or guidance of their gods. However, despite this, Mary continued to pray to Matter, and although Matter burned her body with blue flames every day, the nature god was still kind enough to provide bread for her to feed Will. Mary apologized for not telling him the truth sooner, and because he wanted to share her pain, Will asked Mary for the opportunity to pray with her in the temple every morning. She granted him this wish, and for the next 5 years, Will began to improve in his spiritual life alongside Mary, as she taught him everything about how to live a peaceful and devoted life. She also taught him how to chant the sacred words of the gods, and when Will completed a 5-day prayer marathon for the first time, Mary promised to make all of his favorite foods for dinner. Now that he was 13 years old, Will's magical training with Gus started to get more intense, as the old geezer instructed him to cram tons of spell books every night. His physical training with Blood also became hectic, and after practicing his sword stance for over an hour, Blood instructed Will to fight against a low-ranking demon ghoul. Will was initially scared by this challenge, but when the monster tried to attack him, he quickly blocked the strike with his shield, before slicing the ghoul with his sword and turning it into dust. Blood was shocked at how fast Will was able to take down his opponent, and so to make things even harder for him, Blood decided to take Will for a training session at the City of the Undead. They entered a secret passage, and along the way, Blood explained that the place used to be a home for dwarves, until a huge apocalypse happened, turning everyone into mindless zombies. Blood suddenly stopped walking, and he told Will that his next challenge was to escape without getting killed, before dropping his lantern into the water and vanishing into thin air like a ninja. Will used an illumination spell to transform his shield into a giant light bulb, but before he could think of a plan, 2 undead soldiers came marching by, so he drew out his sword and turned them to dust. Walking deeper into the tunnel, Will came across an E-rank demon ghoul, and he paused for a while to think of a strategy, because the monster was also capable of casting magical spells. Eventually, Will decided to face his fears, so he used the silence spell to stop the monster from performing magic, before jumping off the ground and smashing his sword on the ghoul's head. The monster fell apart and turned to dust, but Will realized that his trusty sword had broken in half, so he decided to give himself a reward by claiming the demon ghoul's magical spear. Continuing with his journey, Will got to a part of the tunnel that was filled with a misty haze, and when he looked closer, he was surprised to see Gus, who seemed more serious than usual. Will tried talking to him to find out what he was doing there, but Gus remained silent, until suddenly, he spoke a spell that caused a giant rock monster to emerge from under the ground. Will was shocked by this random attack, but without getting too emotional, he quickly used his spear to stab a writing on the monster's belly, causing it to crumble down into a pile of rocks. Will was barely catching his breath when Gus began shooting rocks at him at an insane speed, followed by a web spell, and although he managed to avoid both of them, the attacks just kept on coming. He was knocked down by one of the rocks into a puddle of grease, but when Will saw that Gus had no plans of stopping, he decided to stay alive by using his spear to stab the wizard ghost. Will charged at Gus with all of his might, but held his spear back a few inches from the old man's chest, causing the wizard to pause for a second and turn off his spells. However, Will eventually dropped the spear, and with tears in his eyes, he said that although Gus was the one who attacked him first, he couldn't bring himself to kill his own grandfather. Will knew that there was a good reason why the cranky old ghost wanted him dead, so he told Gus that if it was really important, he should kill him but make the death a quick and painless one. However, those words touched Gus, so he apologized to Will for going too far, while telling him that it was only just a lesson, and that he should keep it a secret from Blood and Mary. Will suspected that Gus was only pretending so that he would ignore all the brutal attacks, but when they got back home, Will kept to his promise and said nothing about the incident to Blood and Mary. The next day, with Gus's help, Will was able to appraise his weapon, so he learnt that the spear was named Pale Moon by its creator, and that its spearhead could emit light magic. Will also notice some writings on the shaft of the spear, which when spoken correctly, controlled how long or short the weapon could become based on the wielder's needs. He continued to visit the haunted tunnel to improve his strength, but when he arrived for his next magical training, Gus said that it was time for a different lesson, so he told Will to search the city for gold coins. However, when he returned at night with the coins, Will saw some game boards on the table, and he immediately realized that Gus and Blood had set him up to join them for a gambling spree. Will became furious and he initially refused the offer to join them, but when Gus and Blood said that he was just scared of losing to them, Will decided to prove his worth by playing the game. They played a few rounds, until Mary barged into the room and caught them red-handed, after which she forced them to kneel on the ground, and listened to her lecture on morality. Later that night, Gus invited Will to his chambers, where he explained to him that on the day of his 15th birthday, as a rite of passage ritual, Blood would challenge him to the toughest duel ever. Will promised to do everything in his power to win the fight and earn his stripes, but surprisingly, Gus told him to lose the brawl instead, and when Will asked why, the wizard just stayed silent. Annoyed that Gus and the others always kept secrets from him, Will refused to do what he asked, and when the wizard continued to hide his reasons, Will told him to choke on it, before storming out of the room. At the inner temple, Blood and Mary told Will that he would soon need to choose a guardian amongst the gods, in which he would swear a sacred oath to, in exchange for protection and divine favor. Asking them for advice, Blood said that he swore to Blaze, the god of fire, and Mary said that she swore to Matter, the nature god. Will wanted to know about Gus as well, and they told him that he swore to Whirl, the god of wind, to have a fun and carefree life, but Will wondered if Gus was actually living up to that promise. Blood told Will that although swearing an oath was the fastest way to become a great warrior, it often came with many challenges along the way, and so he should think carefully before taking any vows. 2 days before his rite of passage, Will was doing chin-ups on a tree branch, when Blood walked up to him and said that it was time for them to bond over some quality PG grape juice. Will was initially hesitant about this plan, but he eventually gave in to Blood's offer, and the both of them drank so many shots of apple cider vinegar that they became too drunk to even walk properly. Blood suggested that they have some teenage fun by peeking at Mary while she was taking off her plot armor, and although Will got expelled for this sort of thing in his past life, he was too drunk to disagree. They walked up to Mary's room and began to watch the show, but just as the main event was about to start, Will tripped and fell through the door, causing Mary to step back and cover up her body. She demanded to know what they were doing by her door, and when Blood confessed that they only wanted to know what mummy plots looked like, Mary responded by putting Will to sleep with a hot slap. Damn! Waking up the next morning, Will noticed something slimy on his bedsheet, and when he remembered that he had almost seen Mary's melons last night, he realized that it was his first wet dream. While he was washing away the evidence by the well, Blood came over and started laughing when he noticed what had happened, so Will decided never to take advice from a drunken ghoul ever again. Following that weird incident, it was finally time for Will's ultimate battle against Blood, and after Mary helped him put on his silver armor, they both walked over to the field to meet his opponent. Blood explained the rules of the brawl, stating that no magic tricks or street fighting were allowed, and after Will had understood everything, he pulled out his sword and went in for a strike. Blood held back the attack with his mighty sword, and he began slashing Will's shield multiple times at full speed, forcing the young warrior to step away and find his balance. Will flung his dagger at Blood's face before jumping up to land a surprise hit, but the skeleton anticipated this move, so he deflected the knife and used his sword to block the rookie's attack. After that plan had failed, Will knew that the only way to land a hit on Blood and possibly win the fight was by charging at the skeleton warlord with all of his strength. He launched himself at his opponent, and when Blood tried to hack him up with his sword, Will held the weapon down with his shield, before climbing it like a ramp to push Goliath's corpse to the ground. He swung his sword for the finishing strike, but Blood trapped the weapon between his ribs, before flinging Will off his body with one hand and forcing the rookie to surrender. Blood was impressed by Will's technique, but Mary scolded him for using a cheap move to win the fight, after he had ruled it out from the start, and Will decided not to come in between their lovers' quarrel. As a reward for almost beating him in the fight, Blood gave Will his most powerful demon sword, the Overeater, and he explained that the sword was powerful enough to defeat a god's human form. He added that with every strike of the demon blade on an opponent, Overeater would suck out their life force and transfer that energy to its wielder, making Will strong enough to take down a dozen men all at once. However, Blood warned Will not to depend on the demon blade for every fight, because according to him, Overeater had the power to weaken his spiritual life and turn him into a mindless zombie. Following the talk on enchanted weapons, Blood and Mary finally decided to tell Will the story about their past, starting with how the city was destroyed many years ago by a ruthless demon lord. They explained that the demon lord had formed an alliance with Iltreat, the god of dimensions, and Stagnate, the god of the undead, leading to an ultimate war between good and evil that destroyed continents. The demon lord was feared by all creatures on Earth, as he could create armies and beasts out of his own blood, and was immune to all forms of weapons or magic except for enchanted blades. The demon lord took over their city in a matter of seconds, and he created an unlimited amount of minions out of the ocean. But just when all hope was lost, Blood, Mary, and Gus united to take down the Mad King. The demon lord, who originally owned Overeater, regained all of his lost energy from the powerful blade, so Blood and the gang planned on defeating him by stealing the precious weapon. They succeeded in this plan, as Gus used his magic to subdue the demon lord, and Blood snatched the demon blade from the Mad King, while Mary kept the both of them safe with her healing powers. However, the demon lord was just getting started, and he transformed into a titan-like monster so huge and invincible that none of Blood's deadliest attacks could even come close to defeating it. Seeing that their offensive attacks were useless against the demon lord, Gus and Mary decided to use their combined mystical abilities to trap the Mad King and seal him deep beneath the earth. Moments after, Stagnate's human form arrived at their city, and he offered the three of them the gift of immortality in exchange for getting rid of all the demons that lurked in their town. Stagnate's mission was to create a world that was free from the cycle of death and rebirth by turning everyone into ghouls, but he needed to make sure that the demon lord couldn't interfere with this plan. Therefore, he recruited Blood and the others to become high-ranking ghouls who would watch over the Mad King's seal forever, and because they had no other option, the heroes accepted Stagnate's contract. After a few years of being glorified watchdogs, the heroes were ambushed by a pair of ugly demons, who wanted to use the blood of a little child to free their Mad King from captivity. However, Blood quickly took down the minions, and after arguing with Gus for a bit, he and Mary decided to raise the child as their own, to make up for the life that they could have lived. Now that the story was over, Will finally understood his true purpose in this life, which was to head out into the world and become a beacon of hope to the living creatures that still existed. Blood and Mary were giving him their final words of wisdom when suddenly a dark cloud swirled in the sky, and Stagnate's human form arrived, asking the heroes if they were ready to die again. Will's body was forced down by Stagnate's power, making him unable to fight, but a magical spell suddenly broke the ground, and when Will turned to look, he saw Gus getting ready to fight the undead god. Stagnate created a dark matter force field to block out Gus's magic, but the old wizard used a chain spell to hold him in place, before commanding a giant tornado to surround the evil god. Using a quadruple spell cast, Gus was able to erase Stagnate's human body temporarily, and then he checked on Blood and Mary to make sure that their souls were still intact. They all apologized to Will for letting him witness such a terrifying moment, but the battle wasn't over yet, because a dark energy suddenly attacked Gus, ripping the tail away from his body. The strange phantom also brought down Blood and Mary, after which Stagnate suddenly reappeared, and began mocking Gus for thinking that he could defeat a god with a bunch of useless spells. Stagnate grabbed Gus by the neck, but then he decided to kill the old man another time, and he focused his attention on Will, thanking him for being the reason that he could finally claim their souls. Stagnate explained that when the heroes had signed a contract with him, he made them swear to become his personal servants if they ever lost their attachment to protecting the Mad King's seal. Because the heroes began to care for Will more than their jobs as high-ranking ghouls, Stagnate said that he now had the right to claim their souls and turn them into mindless servants. Will fell to the ground after hearing the horrible revelation, but Stagnate offered him a chance to grow stronger by joining his army, and he said that he would return the next day for his answer. After taking his parents back to the temple, Will suddenly understood why Gus had tried to kill him at the dungeon, because he was trying to stop Mary and Blood from losing their souls to stagnate. Realizing that their deaths would be his fault, Will broke down crying as he remembered how he was also powerless to stop his parents from dying in his previous life. Waking up the next morning, Will found himself surrounded by Blood and the others, and when he tried apologizing to them, they told him to stop because he wasn't responsible for anything that happened. They told him to cheer up because today was his birthday, which meant that he was finally mature enough to leave home and start up a new life in a place filled with new people and endless adventures. However, Will didn't share their excitement about the day because he felt like it was only a reminder about how he had killed himself like a coward after having such a horrible past life. Will decided to tell them the truth about how he was born with memories of a former life, but when he started calling himself a worthless child, Mary came to the rescue with her slap of holy retribution. She dried the tears from his eyes, while telling him to man up and take charge of his life, because the gods had blessed him with a second chance, which meant that he had to prove his worth to them. She commanded him to get up immediately, and Will responded like a soldier who just got into the army, after which he promised to defend all of them from Stagnate's wrath. Later that night, after praying to the righteous gods for protection, Will went out to face Stagnate. And when the undead god asked for his reply, Will said that he would rather die than join his army. Stagnate decided to teach Will a lesson by making him battle against 100 undead soldiers, but the young warrior was able to take them down using his advanced fighting techniques. Impressed by his display of bravery, Stagnate asked Will to join his army one more time, saying that they could conquer the continent together and put an end to the harsh reality of death. He poured out his blood into a metal cup, asking Will to sign a contract with him by drinking it. And because Will was deceived by the thought of an eternal life, he moved forward to make the deal. However, when he got close enough to grab the cup, Will changed his mind, and he used Overeater to chop off Stagnate's hand instead, followed by 2 powerful strikes that restored the energy to his own body. He was about to land the finishing blow, when Stagnate turned his blood into a cobra that coiled around Will's leg and held him in place, before using its deadly venom fangs to send him into a coma. Will woke up in a shallow water body, and while he was trying to figure out whether or not he was alive, a strange woman with black hair, holding a lantern in one hand, suddenly walked up to him. He immediately recognized her as the goddess of light, Grace Fiel, and he remembered how she was the one who had guided him across the water just before he was reborn as a child. Asking him why he had rejected Stagnate's offer, Will told Grace Fiel that he had made a decision to experience life to the fullest this time around, and that signing Stagnate's contract would only defeat this purpose. Will also added that by choosing to become an immortal ghoul, he would give up his humanity along with all the other things that made life worth living, like the joy of having friends and a family. Touched by this confession, Grace Fiel stretched out her hand to Will, saying that he was worthy of her blessings, and with a gentle smile on her face, she agreed to become his guardian deity. Returning to the battlefield, Will tossed the snake from his body before kneeling down to say a quick prayer, and as Stagnate observed this, he mocked the young warrior for surrendering so quickly. However, Will's body suddenly became covered by the blue flames of Mary's blessing, and after he had regained his strength, he swore an oath to Grace Fiel to become a torchbearer of justice in the world. When Stagnate realized that Will had partnered up with Grace Fiel, he lost all sympathy for the young warrior and commanded his army of undead soldiers to destroy him on the spot. Luckily, Will was armed with the divine power of the goddess of light, so he wiped them out with just one strike, sending their souls back into the cycle of death and rebirth. Stagnate was furious that the little pest had the courage to challenge him, so when Will charged at him with his demon blade, Stagnate blasted the ground with dark magic, before vanishing into thin air. Will was looking around the battlefield to anticipate Stagnate's next move, when Grace Fiel's spirit touched him gently on the shoulder and pointed in the direction of the temple before vanishing. Will realized that Stagnate had tricked him and was actually aiming for his parents, so he used his speedster spell to rush back home, in the hopes that he could stop the undead god just in time. However, when he got to the prayer room, Stagnate had already trapped Gus and was about to take out Blood and Mary, and although Will was using magic, he knew that he wouldn't be fast enough to stop the god. He charged at Stagnate with his demon blade nevertheless, but before Will could land a clear hit, Matter's spirit emerged from her statue, and she struck the undead god with blasts of holy light. The nature goddess nodded gently at Mary before returning back to her statue, and as Will watched the tears run down Mary's face, he realized that Matter had never actually hated her from the start. Mary had been filled with so much hatred after signing Stagnate's contract that she didn't bother seeking forgiveness at all, and she believed that Matter had been punishing her all this while with the blue flames. However, the fire that consumed Mary during her daily prayers was actually a manifestation of her own impure emotions, and now that she had seen Matter's face, she could finally let go and be free. Using Matter's attack to his advantage, Will created a diversion by aiming his divine powers at Blood and Mary, and Stagnate fell for the trap when he blocked the light beam with his dark magic. However, before the evil god could figure this out, Blood attacked him heavily from behind, while Will used his speedster magic to charge forward and force Stagnate to the wall with his demon blade. He began slashing the evil god at super speed from all directions, after which he used his blade to stab right through Stagnate's undead heart and told him to rot in hell. The intensity of Overeater's demon magic vaporized Stagnate's body into nothing, and Will swore on the spot never to uphold any other god's promise or blessing above that of Gracefield. Blood and Mary went over to hug Will and congratulate him for defeating Stagnate, and when Blood suggested that they celebrate, Gus said that he would bring out his special batch of PG grape juice. Will was excited by the sound of an exotic beverage, but Mary warned him not to get drunk and mess up like last time, unless she would unleash all of Matter's fury on his tiny plot gun. Gus flew away to grab the drinks, but when Blood and Mary tried to follow him behind, they fell back down because of how weak their bodies had become from all the fighting. Will was surprised by this, and when he asked for an explanation, Blood and Mary said that by defying Stagnate and breaking the terms of his contract, they no longer had the right to exist as ghouls. However, because of his vow with Gracefield serving as a payment for their sins, their souls could finally return to the goddess of light and enter back into the cycle of death and rebirth. Although he understood everything, Will wasn't happy to hear that they were leaving so soon, and he cried bitterly for them to stay back. But Mary said that it was only natural for parents to die before their kids. Will tried to act tough and pretend like it was okay, but he couldn't help breaking down in tears while telling his parents that he would have loved to show them their grandkids in the future sometime. Blood and Mary told him to remain strong for their sakes, and his dad even advised him to bag 3 hotties after now. But Mary scolded him, saying that it was better for Will to love only one woman. She added that because of his oath to Gracefield, his path in life would not be an easy one. But despite whatever hardship he might face, he should never hesitate to show love and kindness to others. Mary hugged him one last time, and as both of his parents were speaking out words of blessings to him, Will could see their true forms reflecting from a misty haze above. Gus arrived moments later with the drinks, and after they all had a good laugh, it was time for Blood and Mary to go, so Will knelt down and prayed for them before releasing their souls over to Gracefield. The next day, Will buried his parents' bodies in the warmth of the morning light, and after setting up 2 gravestones to remember them by, he promised to always honor their memories with a good life. Will asked Gus why Stagnate's contract hadn't killed him as well, but the old man immediately threw a tantrum, calling Will an evil grandchild and accusing him of wanting to steal his precious gold. However, Will said that he was only joking, and Gus ended up giving him a fat sack of cash containing all of the gold, diamonds, and other jewels that he had acquired throughout his lifetime. After this, Gus explained to Will that he was only alive because he had struck a deal with Gracefield to guard the Mad King's seal for another 10 years, until Stagnate recovered his powers. He also said that Blood and Mary had refused to make the same decision, because they believed that it would only make them greedy for more years to spend alongside their son. After packing his Adventure Time kit, Will was prepared to head out into the world, but as Gus escorted him outside, he stopped him and said that it was important for Will to have a last name to go by. Adopting an ancient custom created by elves, Gus combined both of his parents' first names to give him the surname of Maryblood, and Will joked that he would use Gus's initials as his middle name. The old man said that it was a dumb idea, but Will told him that he would do it anyway, and he waved at his grandfather for a few seconds before walking away to explore the lands ahead. Will fought low-ranking demons on his way to find other humans, and after walking for 2 weeks straight, he came across a ruined city that looked similar to the one back home. On a closer look, he realized that there was a huge crater in the middle of the city, and failing to find any humans around, he prayed to Gracefield to save the souls of all the dead people. He continued his journey until he came to a huge break in the road, and so he decided to camp there for the night and eat dinner, before resuming through a different path the next day. While counting his steps through the forest, Will heard a rustling sound among the trees, and when he pulled out his spear to fight, a wild boar suddenly jumped out from behind a huge stump. Without thinking too much, Will used his magical weapon to stab the animal's heart, and when he looked closer at the boar, he realized that it had already been wounded by an arrow. However, before he could figure out the culprit, a mysterious archer pointed an arrow at him, and Will noticed that the arrow's tail matched with that of the arrow on the wild boar's body. Both warriors held their weapons tightly as they observed each other closely. However, when he noticed a familiar crystal on the archer's bow, signifying that they were related to an elf clan, Will spoke a few words from a popular elven poetry to put his opponent at ease. When he heard those words, the archer took off his hood, revealing a male face with long silver hair, and he told Will to step away from the boar, because the animal belonged to him alone. Will almost apologized to the archer, but held himself back when he remembered all of Blood's lessons on manliness, and he stood his ground instead, saying that he was the one who ended up killing the beast. The archer agreed to negotiate with Will about how they would share the meat, and although Will wasn't much of a sweet talker, He ended up getting the head and leg portions of the boar. When it was time to cook the meat, Will took out a frying pan from his bag, and he lit up a fire using a basic magic spell. But the archer didn't know this, so he praised Will for his adventurous skills. Will recited a long prayer to Matter for their food. But when he noticed the impatient look on the archer's face, he quickly ended the verse, after which they began munching on the delicious boar. Later that evening, Will asked the archer for directions to the next city, but the marksman was hesitant to help, because he noticed that Will didn't look like anyone he had ever met before. However, he pointed him in the direction of a nearby village, and began walking away. But when Will asked if he could crash in his place for the night, the archer gave him a mean look and told him to get lost. Will understood that it was selfish for him to expect that the archer would allow a total stranger to stay in his house, and he offered to light up the road along the forest for him instead. Despite this kind gesture, the archer told Will to buzz off, and he spoke some strange words, after which little firefly creatures appeared out of nowhere to serve as his light source. The elf said that the creatures were fairies, but just before he left, Will told him his full name, and when he asked for his in return, the archer gave him a cold stare, before saying that it was metal. Will set up his tent in the forest, and after having some of the pig meat for dinner, he rested for the night. But while he was asleep, Gracefeel appeared in his dreams with a divine revelation. He saw a vision of a village in flames, with Menel as one of the victims. So when Will woke up, he quickly grabbed his spear, and headed straight for the nearby settlement. He hid behind a tree to observe the area, but when he heard arrows flying towards two random villagers, he immediately jumped in front of them and used his shield to protect the strangers. Will wondered if the guys were friends with Menel, but when he observed the feather tails on the arrows that shot at them, he realized that Menel was actually the real villain in his dream all along. He saw the hooded elf standing on a roof, and when Menel fired his arrows at them again, the two guys who stood behind Will yelled out to inform the other villagers about the ongoing attack. Menel tried to escape, but Will caught up to him using his speedster magic, and when the elf summoned a large earthquake to shake the earth, Will reversed this technique by stomping hard on the ground. Menel ordered the fairies to launch a fireball at his opponent, but Will quickly erased this basic spell, before jumping forward to defeat Menel by jabbing the head of his spear deep into the elf's gut. Will trapped Menel and his criminal friends with a web spell, and while everyone was arguing about the invaders, one of the villagers from earlier introduced himself to the young warrior as John. John apologized for all the stress that they had caused him, and he introduced Will to their chief elder, an old man named Tom, who thanked him for saving their village from the nighttime raiders. When Tom asked the villagers for suggestions on how to deal with the criminals, most of the men wanted an outright death sentence. So the chief elder told Will to come up with a better idea. Will suggested that they give the raiders a fair trial, and the following morning, Tom the elder asked Menel and his companions to defend their actions in front of all of the villagers. The men said that they had chosen to become raiders because they no longer had any wives, shelter, food or water after their own village had been attacked by deadly demons. However, Menel spoke up for the men, saying that he was the one who tricked them into following him after their village was destroyed, and that they should hang him and spare them instead. The angry villagers refused to accept Menel's terms, but Tom told the men to shut their mouth holes, while reminding them that Menel had saved their city from danger many times in the past. Despite his obvious gratitude, the chief elder had no choice but to sentence the criminals to death for the safety of their village. But Will could feel in his heart that this wasn't the right decision. Using the financial skills that he learnt from Gus, Will offered to bail the raiders from their death sentence by giving the village a huge sum of money as compensation for their crimes. When Tom the elder asked why he was doing all of this, Will said that he hated the demons more than anything, and that he had sworn to Gracefeel, the goddess of light, to always stand up for good in this world. In addition to this, Will told them that he was going to defeat all the demons lurking in the neighboring village, and that they should allow Menel the elf to escort him on this journey. After listening to his reasons, Tom allowed Will to carry on with his plans, and all the other citizens from the neighboring settlement were transferred to their own village for protection. Will and Menel journeyed through the forest to their destination, and when the elf asked what his battle strategy was, Will said that he trusted in the power and light of his guardian deity. When it turned dark, they stopped to rest for the night, and while having dinner, Menel emphasized that he was only going to guide Will to the demon-haunted village and had no intention of fighting them. Noticing his cold attitude, Will asked if he had done anything wrong, and Menel replied that he wasn't exactly keen on being besties with a trust fund baby who was sheltered from reality, so Will just accepted the situation and slept off. At the break of dawn, they arrived at the village, and Menel went out to confirm the location of the demons, before returning to map out a sketch of the temple they were hiding. Following this, Will launched an attack on the demons who were performing some dumb ritual at the time, and by using a combination of his magical and physical powers, he got rid of all of them in no time. Menel praised his strength and asked what his training routine was like, but Will simply said that he consumed lots of bread like a glutton, and when they went to scout for survivors, all the villagers seemed to be dead. However, a voice cried out to them from beneath a pile of rubble, which turned out to be Menel's adopted brother, who was already undead, looking so weak and wasted that Menel was too devastated to touch him. Will lifted the boy and introduced himself as Menel's friend, so Menel became courageous enough to hold his brother's hands, and he told him to rest and fall asleep. Will prayed for Grace Field's light to guide the child's soul, after which he vanished in a glowing light, and Menel apologized for misjudging Will to be some spoiled brat, who happened to earn the god's blessings by mistake. For the rest of the day, Menel practiced Will's prayer ritual and held the hands of the undead, praying for the goddess of light to guide their souls into the afterlife. Until this point, they had searched everywhere for demons or survivors and found neither, so Will was ready to go. But Menel had one more location in mind. He led the way to a house, before calling out an old lady by the name of Marple. But when she came out, Will sensed that she was an SS rank ghost, whose powers might be too tough for him to handle. Surprisingly though, she told him to remain calm because she hadn't transformed into an evil ghost, and was actually still willing to return to the afterlife. Menel told her that Will was a genuine priest who could guide her into the afterlife, but the old lady was worried about something else, and after staring at him for a while, she realized that he had been up to no good. She advised Menel to change his ways, saying that even though he had twisted ways of dealing with life's problems, he was ultimately a good person at heart, and shouldn't engage in stealing people's properties. Frustrated, Menel broke down and told her to shut the hell up, because she wouldn't understand how painful it was to look on helplessly while his closest friends and family lost their lives. He believed that praying to the gods was a useless idea, because it seemed like they had abandoned him, and the fact that he was an elf only meant that he would keep on seeing evil for hundreds of years to come. When he was done ranting, Marple told Menel to pick himself up and turn a new leaf, because even though the gods allowed bad things to happen to him, they still loved him and had granted him a second chance. She told Will to watch over him while she was gone, and she revealed to them that the demons actually came from somewhere deep within the forest, and were being controlled by an unknown evil boss. She hugged the sulking elf and waved him goodbye, before ascending into the heavens, after which the guys gathered up all the dead soldiers, and were later joined by the surviving villagers to bury them. At night, the villagers threw a party for Will to celebrate his bravery in rescuing their village, and afterwards, he met up with Menel at a hilltop to discuss his intentions of destroying the demon lair. Even after hearing that it was a danger zone which had claimed every single soul that dared to visit it, Will insisted that he had to check it out and pray for the souls of the undead. Out of curiosity, he asked Menel what old Marple was like in her lifetime, and Menel was forced to narrate his boring life story, starting all the way from when he was born. Soon after she gave birth to him, Menel's mother died, and because his mother developed plot with a human, Menel had always been treated as an outcast by the elven community because he was a half-elf. After enduring so much suffering, Menel fled the town and eventually became an adventurer with a group of strangers, but was soon betrayed by his teammates who poisoned him in order to steal all the treasure. Although Menel was able to take down the backstabbers, he was slowly dying from the effects of the poison, until Marple found him, welcomed him into her home, and took care of him till he recovered. Apparently, she had done this for many other villagers, and that was basically how most people ended up living in that settlement, though no one knew why Marple was so nice to all the strangers. When he finished this narration, Menel thanked Will for all he had done since their first meeting, and he asked Will to serve as a medium for Gracefield to become his guardian deity. Will prayed for Menel to be covered by the protection of the goddess of light, and the half-elf swore an oath to Gracefield that he would make up for his sins by living a righteous life. After the prayer session, they returned to the party to have fun with the rest of the villagers, and at the end of the day, Will realized that he had finally found someone that he could call a friend. The following morning, the locals scavenged the place. The men said that they would be heading to a city called Whitesales to buy new tools, and when Will asked them what this place was, Menel decided to give him another boring history lesson. Basically, Whitesales became an immigration center for those in the north after the Great Demon attack occurred, and people from across the continent, as well as those who still worshipped Gracefield, visited the great city. Hearing that the faithful people had been scattered across the continent, Will became so burdened and disturbed, because he feared that there would be fewer people who still believed in his goddess. However, Menel snapped him back to reality by reminding him that the villagers were too poor to afford anything for now, so Will suggested that they explore some ruins and split the treasure amongst themselves. On their way back, a screaming girl drew their attention to a huge ape that was terrorizing an old man, so Will intervened by entering into a staring competition with the beast, until the scared animal was forced to run away. The bubbly little girl who introduced herself as Bee was amazed by Will's weird way of dealing with the ape, and she hyped him up because not many people she knew could do something that crazy. She referred to the spineless fool as Tonio, a massive failure who resorted to becoming a merchant. And even if that wasn't the truth, the old man never got the chance to defend himself. He said that they were on their way to Whitesales, and Menel was happy to hear this, so he introduced himself and Will, while telling them that they were headed to the same city as well. Tonio thanked them for helping out with the ape situation, explaining that the bouncers he hired had scammed them and ran away when they saw the animal, leaving them to die in the middle of the woods. Will was about to make a dumb offer, but Metal told him to shut up and let him handle the negotiations, since he was just a spoiled brat with zero knowledge of how business worked. He struck a deal with Tonio to lead them to a good cow dealer in his hometown, as payment for the debt that he owed them for saving his life from King Kong. On their way there, they stopped by a village and Bee performed in her sold-out O2 arena, while Tonio used the opportunity to gather up some customers, and he even offered Will a deal. He asked Will to cure the sick with his healing powers, as a way to restore the people's faith in the goddess, while Tonio lured them into buying his products, since Will refused to charge anybody for healing them. After Will had cured everyone, Menel said that it was really cool to have such amazing powers, but Will told him that it was all thanks to Gracefield's blessings, and that he couldn't take any credit for it. As they traveled past other villages, they continued their business as usual, and by the time it was dark, they settled down to rest in an abandoned building for the night. Bee kept them entertained by performing a song of heroism, one specifically about blood, Gus and Mary, and as Will listened to the lyrics of the song, he realized how little he knew about the conquests of his adopted parents. The song spoke about what they did while they were still humans, a story of what happened when they came across a village that was being terrorized by a mighty dragon. The villagers decided to sacrifice a beautiful half-elf to appease the dragon, but Mary was against the idea, and she wanted to save her, while Blood was all about the cash and Gus was indifferent about the whole thing. Obviously, this song was quite different from the reality that Will knew, because their personalities had been switched up a little in the song. But he kept on listening. The heroes were met by a young boy who offered them gold coins to save the elf girl, and when Blood turned him down and said that they weren't so cheap, the boy added a few more silver coins to the payment. However, Blood still wanted some more, and he couldn't believe that his comrades were willing to sell themselves so cheaply. But, because of the boy's bravery and determination, he agreed to help him. Later that day, Mary and Gus held down the beast with their combined enchantments, while Blood charged in with his mad fury and slayed the dragon by chopping its head off. The young boy and the half-elf thanked the heroes for their help, and were about to leave the village, so Blood gave them an enchanted dagger so that they could protect themselves from creatures along the way. Gus gave them a sack filled with coins, advising them to start a business with it and get rich, and he told them his real name as a password for when they next meet in the future. Even years after they had grown up, the man and the elf girl kept on waiting for Gus in the Fertile Kingdom, hoping to meet anyone who knew the old man by his real name, so that they could return what he gave to them. When Bee finished her song, Will broke down crying, because he was glad to know that there were still people alive who remembered the three adventurers and their achievements. Early the next day, Will was practicing with his spear when Tonio walked up to him, saying that he had never met someone so powerful and educated, yet so selfless and humble as he was. He asked Will to be sincere about what he truly wanted in life, and Will replied saying that he just wanted to have friends and gather more knowledge about different things in the world. In response, Tonio said he was willing to become Will's friend, in addition to Menel and Bee, and they went back inside for breakfast before hitting the road to continue their journey. On the way, Tonio revealed that the boy from Bee's song earlier was King Edward, who eventually died, leaving his moronic son to inherit the throne of the Fertile Kingdom. However, he said that Edward's brother, Prince Ethel, was still living as the Crown Prince of Whitesales and was an excellent leader who properly governed the affairs of the city. Just then, Bee ran over to hold Will's hand, and she dragged him to see the view from above of the most beautiful city in the world, after which she told him it was Whitesales. As the group made their way into the breathtaking city, they weren't inspected by anyone at the entrance, because of laws made by Ethel to ease business transactions in and out of the city. They walked by the market and Will was amazed at how much energy the people put into keeping up with the latest fashion trends, especially after seeing their beautiful jewelry. He was equally thrilled when he came across what he had perceived to be solar-powered streetlights, but really, they were just practice lampposts for newbie magicians. The public bath was great too, and the water looked crystal clear, because priests in training often used their divine blessings to keep it clean, since everyone was too lazy to clean it up manually. After bathing, they sat down to chow on some delicious and satisfying dishes, after which Will got into the temple and requested to pay his respects to the head bishop of the place. However, the attending priest said that he would have to take a test to prove his divinity, because there were only a few genuine followers of the goddess Gracefield, and for all he knew, Will could just be a scammer. The head bishop of the temple was also skeptical, and further emphasized on proving his identity, so Will narrated the lessons he was taught by the goddess, thereby gaining the clergyman's trust. The bishop told Will to drop some generous donations, and when he left, the attendant explained that the head priest was corrupt and spent all his time at parties, unlike his deputy, who was truly a virtuous man. Will narrated his experience in the temple to his friends back at the hotel room, but their discussion was interrupted by a loud alarm. which was followed by chaos as a dragon began to rain down fire on some buildings. Seeing people thrown into disarray, Will couldn't stand it anymore, so he ran to the top of the temple and began to spit some magical jargon from his mouth, but none of his attacks could still reach the dragon. Watching his useless attempts to defeat the beast, Menel yelled at Will and told him to stop acting like a moron, because it was pointless to use long-range attacks for a winged creature who could easily evade them. After recalling his training with Gus, Will had an idea, and he asked Menel for help with his fairy magic, while telling Bee and Tonio to get rid of the people standing in front of the temple, because he planned on luring the dragon down there. Menel called upon his fairies, while Will used his web spell to strangle the dragon, but that still didn't work out, and he just had to hope that the dragon would fly towards him so that he could land the finishing blow. Luckily, the creature turned its attention to Will, and it launched a fireball at all of them, so Will created a force field around the temple, but the dragon used a mysterious green energy to break through the barrier with ease. Menel quickly stepped in and summoned the wind magic of the fairies, which sent the dragon spiraling to the ground, but this posed a problem soon after, as the creature started to charge its fire breath again. So Will threw his arm around the dragon's neck and used all his might to force it to the ground, and despite the fact that the dragon was breathing fire, Will somehow managed to squeeze the life out of it. All the people around were shocked by this experience, and as Bee and Tonio began to celebrate Will, other citizens joined in and gathered around while praising him. Will thanked Menel for his support, but the half-elf said that he was being too humble, and then suddenly, the both of them were summoned to the palace by a servant of the prince. At the palace, Will bowed politely and earned the prince's respect with his noble character, who was shocked to find out that the attack on the mighty dragon was carried out by just the two of them. As he commended them for their efforts, the prince asked what they would like as a reward, and Will asked if Ethel could spare recruit soldiers to defend the nearby villages that were being attacked by demons. The prince explained to Will that this wouldn't be possible because the city was currently down on manpower, and also because they didn't have enough money to be bothered about other villages. Will then asked for permission to recruit the soldiers himself and get rid of those beasts, but the prince didn't approve this and said that the boy was demanding too much. Realizing that he was overstepping his boundaries, Will apologized to Ethel, but out of the blue, the prince said that he was considering getting rid of Will as well, because his powers could be a threat to the city. Will understood Ethel's reasons for making such a statement, because any ruler would easily become suspicious of a random hero who claims that they can save the world all by themselves. He looked around the room, wondering if it was a smart idea to start a battle, but when Will realized that he and Menel were outnumbered 2 to 3, he decided to negotiate with the prince. He explained to Ethel that it was his duty as a disciple of Gracefield to carry her light into the far reaches of any darkness, after which he knelt down and begged the prince to grant his request. The prince explained that his decision to fight the demons would come with many obstacles along the way, but Will insisted that it was his destiny to bring love and light into their miserable world. Ethel was amused by Will's humor and confidence, but just as he was about to agree, they heard someone shouting behind the door, and the head bishop, Bishop Bagley, suddenly barged into the room. The clergyman had an angry look on his face, and he yelled at Ethel for not asking permission from him, before ordering Will, a newly ordained priest of the temple, to his palace chambers. The prince apologized to the old man for disrespecting his authority, even though he seemed to enjoy seeing the bishop get angry, and he told Bagley about Will's intentions to attack the demons. Bagley was strongly against this plan, but Ethel made things even worse when he said that he intended on turning Will into a knight, and would require the permission and blessing of the temple. Bagley tried to talk him out of it, but Ethel had developed a sudden interest in Will, and wanted him to serve their city as a faraway paladin, so the bishop said that he would think about the matter and get back to him. He ordered Will and Menel to follow him, before walking out of Ethel's chambers, and on their way to the temple, Bagley kept calling the both of them fools, so Menel decided to strike back by calling him a bald fatso. While the two hotheads were arguing, Will started a conversation with the bishop's daughter, Anna, who told him that her father was only angry because he had so much unfinished business to handle. Anna also explained that although she was the bishop's daughter, the two of them were not related by blood, because he had adopted her from an orphanage many years ago when she was younger. Will thanked Bagley for bailing them out from Ethel, but the arrogant bishop told him to spare the useless gratitude, because he was merely doing his job as the chief priest of their temple. Bagley said that he would pray to the gods concerning whether or not to grant him a knighthood, but that until then, Will should stay put in the temple and observe the evening prayer with them. Being an old-school church boy, Will had no idea what the evening prayer was all about, and after calling him a fool as usual, Bagley instructed Anna to get him some spiritual books to read. Later that evening, Will waited patiently in the temple for the bishop to arrive, and as Bagley prayed to the gods, Will observed that his prayer stance was top-notch, so he decided to copy the old man's movements. After the quick prayer session, Will asked the bishop why he never used any of his blessings to help out the people of the city, despite being the most divinely endowed person in the temple. However, Bagley called him a foolish rookie, before explaining that it was wrong for anyone who had earned the blessings of the gods to use them recklessly for fame or personal satisfaction. Bagley also added that because of his role as the head bishop, he often needed to do some dirty work to secure money for the temple, and that using his powers for such a purpose would be a misuse of his blessing. Because of this, Bagley entrusted all the healing and divinity show-off to his vice bishop, while he laid low and did all that was necessary to ensure the development of the temple. Will was impressed by the old man's tactics, but Bagley turned the question around by asking the young warrior how a foolish novice like him planned on taking down a horde of deadly demons. The bishop said that he could help Will break out of his promise with Ethel if only he would give up on the idea, but Will insisted that his duty was to serve Gracefield by spreading the power of her light. Seeing that the boy was a stubborn and devout worshipper of the goddess of light, Bagley agreed to make him a knight, and also lend him a few soldiers that would support his little demon war. After leaving the temple, Will and Menel went over to a local pub to recruit any adventurers who would be dumb and brave enough to join their squad and face off deadly demons. They announced their intention to the entire pub, but after seeing the tiny paycheck that came with the job, most of the adventurers refused to join their team and called them stingy bosses instead. However, a mysterious man suddenly spoke up, saying that he was willing to take the job. So Will walked up to the man and his team, explaining that their mission was to defeat a demon boss. The men were a bunch of low-class ruffians who loved a good adventure, and after Will agreed to take care of their food and shelter during the mission, they all agreed to join his merry squad. The mysterious man introduced himself to Will as Rastov, and when he and Menel were done with their search, they returned to the hotel room to discuss business ideas with Tonio. Tonio explained that the cattle needed for their village at Beast Woods would cost a fortune to get, so Will suggested that they buy some sick ones at a cheaper price instead, after which he could use his divine powers to heal them. Write that down, write that down! Will also offered to lend Tonio some money to begin trading goods between Beast Woods and White Sails, but the merchant said that he would need to teach him some business education first. Will was a bit scared about this idea, but Menel said that it was important. However, when Bee heard that Rastov the Rugged was joining their squad, she quickly made her way to the pub downstairs to interview the famed and mighty hero. Although she was excited to meet the great warrior, Bee quickly lost interest when Rastov began to bore her with his talk on how humility was the foundation of being a noble adventurer. Bee was about to sleep off when suddenly she got a brilliant idea to write a song based on a battle between Will and Rastov, and although he was hesitant at first, Will agreed to fight him after their attack on the demons. The following day, everyone gathered at the temple to witness Will's knighthood ceremony, and after receiving the blessings of both the prince and the vice bishop, the young warrior was declared a knight. After celebrating his entry into knighthood with some of the locals in the city, Will and all of his companions journeyed back to Beast Woods to begin the preparations for their attack against the demons. They started by providing food and manpower to nearby villages, while Anna and some of the other priests, who had followed Will on Bagley's orders, assisted him by healing wounded villagers. Rastov and his crew helped out by patrolling the area and protecting the villagers from deadly demon beasts, while Will resumed his job as a mediator and special advisor to Old Man Tom. Soon after, their boring village turned into a lively business hub, and Will finally understood what Gus had told him many years ago, about how money was the solution to most of life's problems. While he was busy polishing his spear, Rastov walked into Will's tent, informing him that a few of their men were yet to return from the forest after spending 2 weeks on a recon mission. Will informed Menel about this, and after Rastov had gathered a small team of skilled men, they went out into the woods to find the lost warriors, or any signs of a recent demon battle. Along the way, Menel thanked Will for showing up and giving his life purpose again, but Will teased him, saying that he should learn to look people in the eye when expressing his feelings. They arrived at a dark valley, and were shocked to see the dead remains of their lost adventurers. But Menel was more concerned with knowing what sort of beast could create such a huge crater on the ground with only its footprint. The men poured wine on the dead bodies as a sign of respect, and Will prayed for Gracefield to guide their souls. But Rastov said that the body of a certain adventurer was missing from the lot. They followed a trail of adventurer clothing deep into the valley, but Will was too slow to realize that it was all a trap, and the men were suddenly surrounded on all sides by flesh-eating demon beasts. The men wanted to retreat, but Will told them to stay calm and form a shield wall, after which he blessed them with the power of poison immunity, and Menel used his fairy magic to increase their strengths. After a quick battle pep talk, Rastov gave the orders, and the men fired their weapons at the huge beasts. But this didn't stop the creatures from charging straight at the puny humans. However, while all of this was going on, the leader of the demon beasts, a 3-headed creature known as a chimera, suddenly arrived, and it looked hungry for some delicious elf meat. Menel tried to summon a rock barrier with his fairy magic, but he wasn't fast enough, and the chimera slashed him away with just one hit from its powerful lion claw. Will noticed as the creature was about to use its dragon breath to roast his friend, but he was too occupied with the other demon beasts to stop the chimera from unleashing its purple flames on Metal. Out of anger, Will tried to destroy all the other demon beasts with a massive bolt, but his spell cast was interrupted by a two-headed snake, and he ended up getting struck by the lightning instead. However, instead of turning into Shazam, Will became filled with so much despair that he pulled out his demon sword and began slashing at all the evil creatures until none was left standing. Restov held him back before he could turn into a full-blown villain, and he instructed Will to rush over and use his divine powers to save Metal, who was about to die from the effects of the chimera attack. He prayed for Grace Feels Light to heal Metal's wounds, but the pain in his heart was so severe that it stopped his powers from working properly, and Will just broke down crying before passing out beside Metal. Waking up later that night, Will wondered where he was, so Restov explained that they had all retreated with him and Metal to a nearby village, but that the chimera had managed to escape. Worried about Metal, Will tried to get up and visit his wounded friend, but Restov held him back, saying that the half-elf was doing just fine, and that he should lay back and rest some more instead. After Restov had left, Will was stuck in bed with his depressing thoughts, and he wondered what step in his perfect plan had gone wrong for his team to get overpowered by the demon beasts. He realized that it was his fault for not sending scouts to check out the valley earlier on, and also for taking such a small army of men to battle against deadly creatures of unknown strength. Although Restov had told him not to, Will got out of bed, and as he walked in the cold rain, he blamed himself for what happened to Metal because he had thought that the half-elf's strength matched up to his. Along the way, Will met up with B and Tonio, who explained that they had traveled there after hearing the news, and B praised him for single-handedly destroying all of the demon creatures. However, Will said that her story wasn't entirely true, and despite their advice to stay back and rest, he continued walking into the distance to find Metal's hut. When he arrived at his destination, Will knelt down and prayed for Grace Feel to quicken Metal's recovery with her divine light. But he couldn't stop the tears from rolling down his face. Will realized that he had been selfish all this while, for trying to recreate the sort of power dynamic and heroism that his three parents shared through his friendship with Metal. Will had been hesitant to admit that he was actually stronger, because he didn't want Metal and the others to treat him like a god, while he struggled with his problems alone, just like in his former life. Grace Feel appeared to him in a vision, and he promised her that he would defeat all of the demons by himself. But for some reason, the goddess didn't look too happy with this brave decision. Will stepped out of the hut to begin his solo death mission, but before he could go far, Metal suddenly blocked his path and asked him where he was going so late at night. Will said that he was going back to the Valley of Despair so that he could kill the chimera and all the other demon beasts alone, but Metal wasn't happy with that response, so he punched Will in the face. Will was intent on protecting his friend from danger, so he ignored the punch like it was nothing, and when Metal tried to hit him again, he dodged all of his moves before tossing him into the mud. Metal got back up and continued to fight, and when Will saw that the half-elf wasn't ready to give up, he forced his face into the mud before using a karate technique to break his right arm. Despite this move, Metal got up again, and as Will was thinking of different ways to take him out for good, the half-elf used his fairy magic to command a rock shower in his direction. Will was initially going to avoid the attack, but when he realized that the rocks would hit Metal instead, he hesitated and allowed the stones to force him down. That was Metal's plan all along, and he walked up to Will before kicking him in the gut and calling him a coward for leaving all of his teammates behind to face the demons alone. Will said that Metal had no right to call him names or tell him what to do, because they had only met in that forest by chance, and were not related to each other in any way. However, Metal said that he considered Will to be a friend, which was why he wouldn't just sit back and let him throw his life away, all because he got his butt kicked by some demon beasts. He thanked Will for changing his life and for saving the lives of all those villagers, and Metal promised to work hard and get stronger so that he and Will could finally become equals. Hearing those words, Will let the pent-up tears roll down his cheeks for a bit, before admitting that his plan was actually really dumb, and then he grabbed Metal's hand to get back up. They enjoyed the view of the full moon for a while, after which they headed back to the village, where B, Tonio, and the other villagers had been up late waiting for them to return. After hearing everything that had happened, Restov said that Will was lucky to have a friend like Metal, because he could have easily lost his life from being too arrogant just like many other adventurers. Will assured him that he was back to his senses now, and they all agreed that it was time to make preparations for their rematch against Kira the Chimera and her flock of ugly demon beasts. Stepping forward for a quick speech, Will encouraged the men to be brave in the face of danger, and he promised to reward anyone that could kill the demon boss in battle with a sack of gold coins. The next day, Will and his team gathered up more men and mapped out a decent battle plan, before journeying back to the dreaded Demon Valley to face their enemies once again. Will instructed Anna and the other priests to follow from behind and support them with their blessing, while he and the other fighters stayed in the front lines and challenged the evil creatures. The demon beasts charged at them from afar, so Will and the other fighters readied their swords before running straight towards them. while Menel and the other archers helped out with their arrows. Will covered everyone with his poison immunity blessing, and the fighters held back the demon beasts with their mighty shields, before using their weapons to stab the creatures down. While everyone was caught up in the heat of the battle, Will realized that it would have been stupid for him to face the demons alone, because great success could only be achieved by the power of teamwork. After defeating the demons at the valley, Will and Menel went into the forest to find the demon boss, and they saw an old building that looked like it was used as a temple back in the days. But when Will sensed something strange, he suddenly stopped walking, before using his magic to scan the area. Luckily, Will's hunch was right, because his reveal spell exposed a huge chimera standing right in front of them, and when the creature realized that it was no longer invisible, it immediately slashed its lion claw at both of them. Will stepped backwards to dodge the attack, before launching himself forward to stab the chimera's lion head, forcing the creature to lift off the ground with its powerful dragon wings. The chimera fired a flaming arrow at Menel, but Menel was able to counter this attack. Will used an energy field to divert the monster's attack, and Menel held the creature in place with his rock magic, giving Will the perfect chance to stab his spear deep into the chimera's belly. Will realized that the best way to take down the chimera was by killing all of its heads, so after Menel shot an arrow at the goat head's eye, Will finished it off by striking its forehead with his spear. However, the chimera suddenly activated the same mysterious green energy that the dragon at White Sails had used, and it was prepared to destroy both Will and Menel by any means necessary. Realizing this, Will told Menel to stand back, and because he was naturally immune to all forms of poisons, he charged straight at the creature without giving it a second thought. Will held back the flames of its dragon head with his shield, and after Menel used his rock magic to lift the beast off the ground, Will jumped up and stabbed the dragon's neck with his spear. With only one head left, the chimera was now vulnerable, so Will took to the skies with a high Superman jump, before landing back down to jab his spear deep into the creature's lion head. Now that the chimera was defeated, the boys went into the temple to find the demon boss, but were shocked to see that Rastov had gotten there first, and had already taken down a deadly dragon. When they returned to the village, Bee sang a song that she had written specially for Will, and after they had all listened to it, Bee teased Menel that she was going to write one about him as well. As Will and Menel stared down at the village from a hilltop, they observed how peaceful and happy the villagers were, and they knew that they had done the right thing by taking out all the demons. Menel told Will that the villagers were planning on setting up a prayer altar for Grace Field, and Will was happy that the goddess of light was finally getting all the followers that she deserved. Asking him what he planned on doing next, Will said that he hadn't thought about that yet, so Menel advised him to consider becoming the new Lord of Beast Woods. Will immediately laughed at the idea, because he couldn't imagine a newbie knight like him with no influence suddenly becoming a lord. But Menel told him that he was looking at things the wrong way. He explained to Will that because of his role in rebuilding the villages, as well as his support from both Bagley and the prince, he had the right to legally become the new warden of Beast Woods. Will had initially thought that he could just save the villages and then suddenly disappear like his parents used to do, but he realized now that he had to take responsibility for whatever he started. Menel agreed to help him become a great ruler, and as they walked back down, Will imagined rebuilding his hometown someday, and taking his friends to see the gravestones of his beloved parents. Watch this next video. Till next time, my fellow legendary plot masters.